Welcome to the ODE CNP Training on Nonprofit Food Service presented by the Oregon Department of Education Child Nutrition Programs. This training provides you with an overview of the CACFP Policy and Procedure Manual for Center-Based Sponsors, Chapter 7, titled Nonprofit Food Service. In this training, we will review what is nonprofit food service, what does it mean to maintain nonprofit food service, what are the elements needed to document nonprofit food service, what are the factors and criteria to determine if a cost is allowable per federal regulations, what are operational and administrative costs, and why sponsoring organizations must maintain administrative oversight of the program. Nonprofit food service status and nonprofit organizational status are not the same. Just because an organization is registered as a nonprofit organization does not mean that nonprofit food service is automatically met. Nonprofit food service is determined by the food service operations conducted principally for the benefit of the enrolled participants, and that all program reimbursement funds are used solely for the food service operation or for improvement of that food service. A nonprofit organization is a group organized to conduct business for the benefit of the general public without a motive to make profit. In order to maintain a nonprofit food service, all institutions must have a system in place to track income and expenses. Sponsors are responsible for documenting and accounting for the receipt of all nonprofit food service revenue, which consists primarily of the CACFP reimbursement, but would also include interest revenue, rebates, and money received specifically for use in the CACFP. Sponsors are also responsible for being familiar with what allowable costs are, following the ODE-approved budget, and only charging allowable costs to CACFP funds. Documentation of all costs charged to CACFP funds must be maintained. The difference between the nonprofit food service revenue and the nonprofit food service expenses are excess funds and are referred to as the nonprofit food service balance. All excess funds remaining in the nonprofit food service account must be used only for allowable CACFP expenses. The balance of the nonprofit food service account must be monitored to ensure that any remaining funds are not used to cover other business expenses. It is important to remember what was stated in the previous slide. Nonprofit food service is determined by the food service operations conducted principally for the benefit of the enrolled participants, and that all program reimbursement funds are used solely for the food service operation or for improvement of that food service. All institutions must have fundamental business elements in place. These elements are the framework of a financial management system and are necessary to document the proper and efficient use of federal funds. The elements include an adequate accounting system that tracks the revenues and expenses of the organization by program, internal controls, which are the policies and procedures of the organization that are designed to ensure the program achieves its intended result and identify allowable costs, and adequate documentation, which includes maintaining all source documents. These are the original records that contain the details to support transactions entered into the accounting system. These elements will not be discussed in this training, but for more detailed information regarding the elements of financial management systems, internal controls, and documenting nonprofit food service, please visit the CACFP training resource page for a training titled Introduction, which is an overview of the USDA CACFP performance standards. In order to be allowable, costs must be identified as necessary and reasonable. Necessary costs are essential costs. They are recognized as being ordinary, required for the institution to operate, and must be accomplished to fulfill regulatory requirements. Reasonable costs are those costs that meet the prudent standard. That is the type and amount of costs that must not exceed what a prudent person would pay under the same circumstances. All costs charged to CACFP funds must be allowable under federal cost principles and not identified as expressly unallowable. All costs charged to CACFP funds must be included on the ODE-approved budget and must not be incurred prior to the approval of the budget. Adequate documentation must be maintained. This is documentation that supports the cost was incurred, identifies the cost as a program cost, and complies with federal regulations. Please note, inadequate documentation may lead to the disallowance of a cost. Here is an example. Let's say a sponsor purchases a new stove to replace a stove that is no longer working and is not repairable. The sponsor decides to purchase a new stove that they have been dreaming about, as it has excellent reviews from kitchen architects, it is state-of-the-art, and has all the latest features and amenities. Would this be considered necessary and reasonable? The purchase of a replacement stove would be considered a necessary cost, as a stove is needed to prepare CACFP meals. The purchase of a luxury model stove that has many options and capabilities way beyond what is needed to prepare the CACFP meals would not be considered a reasonable cost, and it does not meet the prudent person standard. On the other hand, if the sponsor were to purchase a good quality new stove with the functionality and features necessary in order to prepare CACFP meals, the cost would be considered reasonable and meet the prudent person standard. Please note, only those items included on the approved budget may be charged to CACFP funds. If the purchase of a replacement stove was anticipated when the budget was developed and the purchase price of the new stove does not exceed the budgeted amount, then the sponsor could purchase a new stove that met the necessary and reasonable criteria. If the sponsor did not include the cost of a replacement stove on the budget, or if the purchase price will exceed the budgeted amount, the sponsor would need to submit a revised budget and receive approval from ODE prior to purchasing a new stove. All sponsors must maintain documentation associated with the purchase of the stove. This would include any documents received from the vendor and proof of payment, such as a detailed sale invoice or sales receipt, a canceled check, and the bank statement. In order to determine if a cost is an allowable cost, we will discuss the reference materials available and a brief description of each type. FNS 796-2 Revision 4 is the USDA financial management guidance developed specifically for the CACFP. It applies to all CACFP sponsoring organizations, whether they are public, nonprofit, or for-profit. It contains guidance on monitoring the nonprofit food service, standards for cost principles, guidelines for determining the allowability of costs, and identifies specific unallowable program costs. 2 CFR Part 200 is referred to as the Uniform Grant Guidance. It is not specific to the CACFP. It applies to all public and nonprofit organizations who receive federal awards. It contains the administrative requirements and cost principles of which are required for the management of federal funds. Operating costs are costs that are incurred for the preparation and service of meals to CACFP participants. Examples of these costs are the cost of food purchased to prepare meals, the cost of vended meals, the wages of the cook and others involved in the meal service, the cost of napkins, paper plates, utensils, and similar items used in the meal service, the cost of small appliances or rented equipment used to prepare food, and any other allowable costs that are incurred in the preparation and service of meals. As mentioned in the previous slide, labor costs associated with serving meals to eligible participants are allowable operational CACFP costs. Examples of these types of duties could include menu planning, purchasing food, food preparation, cooking, serving meals, and cleanup after the meal service. All labor costs must be documented and accurately reflect the work performed. Unallowable costs may not be charged to CACFP funds. Some examples of unallowable costs are costs that are not considered reasonable CACFP expenses. This would include food items such as candy, soda, and coffee. This would also include food purchased for personal use or for staff meetings or food from a restaurant. Unallowable costs are costs that are not necessary for the operation or administration of the CACFP. Examples of these costs could include art and craft supplies, diapers, or toilet paper. Costs that are not included in the approved budget are considered unallowable and may not be charged to CACFP funds. All shared costs must be allocated except labor costs. Labor costs may not be allocated. All time charged to CACFP funds must be documented, and only the actual time spent on CACFP duties may be charged to CACFP funds. Any cost that is not properly documented is considered an unallowable cost. It is very important to maintain all documents that support the costs charged to CACFP funds. Administrative costs are costs associated with the planning, organizing, and managing of the food service operation. Examples of these types of costs could include the wages of administration staff developing the budget, training program staff, conducting site monitoring reviews, and submitting monthly reimbursement claims. It could include staff mileage reimbursement for the use of personal vehicles when conducting administrative duties in relation to the CACFP, and any costs incurred for the printing and copying of CACFP forms for record-keeping purposes. Please note, the total of all administrative costs charged to CACFP funds may not exceed 15% of the annual CACFP reimbursement. As mentioned in the previous slide, labor costs associated with the management and administration of the CACFP are allowable costs. Examples of these type of duties could include maintaining records of the nonprofit food service account, completing the annual CACFP budget, compiling records to submit with a monthly reimbursement claim, perform staff training and attending CACFP training, conducting site monitoring reviews, writing review reports, providing technical assistance, and updating annual enrollment forms. Remember, all labor costs must be documented and accurately reflect the work performed. Sponsors must exercise management control over the meal service at all of their sites. Management control of the meal service means that the sponsor is responsible for maintaining contact with the meal service staff, ensuring that there is adequately trained meal service staff on site, and site monitoring of the operations is conducted throughout the period of the program participation. This management responsibility cannot be delegated. The quality of the meal service, the conduct of the site personnel, and the adequacy of the record keeping reflect directly upon the sponsor's performance. Let's review. Nonprofit food service status is determined by the food service operations conducted principally for the benefit of the enrolled participants, and that all program reimbursement funds are used solely for the food service operation and for improvement of that food service. Nonprofit food service is a requirement of all sponsors participating in the CACFP. In order to maintain nonprofit food service, sponsors must have a system in place that documents the receipt of all nonprofit food service revenue, charges only allowable CACFP expenses, and maintains the balance of the food service account. The balance of the nonprofit food service account, also referred to as excess funds, must be monitored to ensure that they are not used to cover other business expenses, and that all funds remaining in the nonprofit food service account are used solely for allowable CACFP expenses. Allowable costs are costs that are included in the OD approved budget. They must be identified as necessary and reasonable. Necessary costs are essential costs. They are recognized as being ordinary and required for the institution to operate. Reasonable costs are those costs that meet the prudent standard. That is, the type and amount of the cost must not exceed what a prudent person would pay under the same circumstances. Unallowable CACFP costs are costs that are not considered necessary or reasonable, are costs that are not included on the CACFP budget, or are costs that were incurred but do not have adequate supporting documentation. Documentation must be maintained to support all costs charged to CACFP funds. In order to be adequate, documentation must support that the cost was incurred, identify the cost as a program cost, and comply with federal regulations. Operational costs are costs that are incurred for the preparation and service of meals to CACFP participants. Administrative costs are costs associated with planning, organizing, and managing the food service operation. Lastly, we discuss that sponsors must exercise management control and administrative oversight over the meal service at all of their sites, and they may not be delegated. This means that the sponsor is responsible for maintaining contact with the meal service staff, ensuring that there is adequately trained meal service staff on site, and site monitoring of operations is conducted throughout the period of the program participation. Thank you for participating in the Nonprofit Food Service Training for the CACFP. If you have any additional questions, please contact your assigned child nutrition specialist. We greatly appreciate the work that you do to fuel Oregon's future.